I think we're ready. A threshold crossed. Israeli authorities and the crimes of apartheid and persecution. Hello, everyone. I would like to welcome you to this event on the newly released Human Rights Watch report on the Israeli apartheid in Palestine, titled "A Threshold Crossed: Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution." The event is organized by the Palestine Academic Group. The Palestine Academic Group, PALAC, is an independent, non-profit, non-partisan academic network that aims to broaden deliberation on the Palestinian national project of liberation, self-determination, and safeguarding the human dignity and historical rights of the Palestinian people. We are privileged today to have three great speakers who are going to share with us their thoughts on this report. Let me introduce the speakers. We have Sarah Lee Whitson. She is the Executive Director of Dawn Democracy for the Arab World Now. Sarah Lee, previously she served as Executive Director of Human Rights Watch Middle East and North Africa Division from 2004 to 2020. We have also Ben White. He is the founding director of the Britain-Palestine Media Center and the author of 4 books, including a book on the apartheid. His book is called Cracks in the Wall: Beyond Apartheid in Palestine, Israel. And we have Diana Butto. Diana is a former legal advisor to the PLO chairman Mahmoud Abbas and Palestinian negotiators. She is also a policy advisor to Al-Shabaka, Al-Shabaka, the Palestinian Policy Network, and she is a former fellow at Harvard Kennedy School of Government. And me, Ibrahim Frihat, a member of the Palestine Academic Group. Let me begin with you, Sarah Lee. Why do you think the report is issued now? How do we get to this? How did we get to this point? This report has taken years before we got to this point. How accurate the documentation is, you think? Are we still going to hear policymakers saying could become an apartheid soon? Or maybe this is going to create or put the facts straight and for the world to recognize what is really going on in Palestine these days? Sarah Lee.
Sure. I mean, apartheid is not new in Palestine. It didn't just happen in 2021. We haven't just discovered it hiding under a rock somewhere. What's new is a global human rights organization, Human Rights Watch, presenting the legal analysis and the factual analysis that's based on a comprehensive review of all of the systems of oppression, the systems of persecution, and documenting their discriminatory intent, their intent to dominate by one racial group over another. And what's also different about this report is that it doesn't just look at the West Bank. I mean, tip of the hat to Jimmy Carter, of course, who first wrote about the reality of apartheid in the occupied territory. But what's different about this report is that it takes an analysis of all of the people controlled by Israel, both within the Green Line Israel and in the occupied territory. I think, why now is that really over the past 10 years, perhaps 15 years, we at Human Rights Watch, and I say we, my recent home, I'm a very loyal and devoted alumni of my former organization. We realized that we couldn't just keep talking about the problem of Palestine from the prism of occupation law and international humanitarian law, because international humanitarian law doesn't speak to what we do in a state of permanent occupation, which is what the current situation is. And while we would routinely say that human rights law is not displaced by international humanitarian law, still that was the dominant lens that we used, which meant that we looked at the situation as a conflict situation. We applied almost exclusively conflict analysis, laws of war analysis, and to those who are not steeped in international law, the critical difference is that an occupying force or a party at war has a lot more leeway in the name of security to carry out restrictions on human rights. But as I said, over 10, 15 years ago, we realized that this could not be the lens that we used anymore, that we had to shift the way we talked about it. And so we started a series of reports, and I really see this as a third in a series of reports that we started, maybe four if you count it right. One is establishing the system of discrimination, the system of racial discrimination that exists between Jewish Israelis and Muslim and Christian Palestinians almost overwhelmingly, although the real factor is the Jewish Israelis versus Palestinians of any and all backgrounds. And that was the report that we issued called Separate but Equal, Separate and Unequal, using the American famous case, because we wanted to drive the parallels of a system of entrenched discrimination that has no legitimate security interests, taking it out of the realm of international humanitarian law, the laws of war, putting it in the realm of human rights and racial discrimination. From there, we called on businesses operating with settlements, within settlements, for settlements to end their settlement businesses. And from there, in 2019, we issued a report that demanded that the framework that be used is one of equal rights, that all the populations living under Israeli authority, not just Israeli occupation, should be entitled to equal rights, and that the benchmark for that should be the rights that Israeli government grants to Israeli citizens. So that was our evolution to shift the narrative away from the laws of war, which we found to be a distraction, which we found to be a permanent state of limbo from which one can never emerge, to now culminating in this report, an apartheid analysis that is steeped in a human rights analysis of the apartheid reality for all of the people under Israel's control.
Thank you, Sarah. Then there was a B'Tselem report before this. And also there was, we heard also about the ICC investigation, the International Criminal Court, and this report, 3, and we're hearing that there possibly other reports are coming. How do we connect the dots? Are rights group now taking a position? Are there any relationships between these reports? You are the author of a book on apartheid. Did you see this happening?
Yeah, first of all, thanks very much for the invitation to participate today. It's a pleasure to join all of you. I think out of the developments that you outlined and mentioned there's different elements at play, and some of them have, some of those phenomenon developments have commonalities. They've also all got distinctive features or factors too. I would say that I think it's important, vital to highlight the one clear consistency in all of those developments, which is the work of Palestinian scholars, activists, and organizations over many, many years, decades, and at considerable risk and at a considerable price in many cases too, to document, advocate, research, drive forward the ICC file, for example, the work done by the likes of the Boycott National Committee around the analysis of apartheid, settled colonialism, occupation, the three sort of not being mutually exclusive, but existing in parallel and so on. So that's a really essential part really of how we've got to where we are now and the developments that you mentioned. There has, of course, also been a lot of work done by human rights activists and campaigners and solidarity activists and so on internationally, in a lot of different countries. I think in more recent years, there's also probably been a case of some political space opening up for these types of developments. I think that political space is due in part, perhaps in large part in some cases, to the collapse of the so-called peace process that took place, the collapse that took place in the Obama administration. But then the years under Trump, as well as what's been happening under Netanyahu's premiership, I think what happened there was that a lot of what effectively served as a kind of protective shield for Israel with respect to not just accountability, but with respect to people seeing things with a clear vision in terms of where they are. Right, the idea that apartheid's always around the corner, the idea that the idea of temporality, which has been mentioned as well. So I think the fact that those developments happened in the last few years will have also contributed to a space opening up for advancing things like an apartheid framework and analysis, and those analyses and positions starting to penetrate and reach mainstream spaces too.
Excellent. Thank you, Ben. Diana, how was the report received in Palestine? How significant you would say it is for them? As you know, they have heard many reports before. There was the Goldstone report, and there are, we keep hearing all these reports. And people, as you know, you're in Ramallah, people are somewhat frustrated with hearing about reports that they don't see any concrete outcome or a difference to their daily life. Is it any different from other reports? You think this one is different?
Thank you, Ibrahim, for inviting me, and I wanted to thank Sarah Lee and Ben for giving me the honor of sharing the stage with you. In terms of how it was received or how it has been received in Palestine, there's been three main reactions. The first, and I would say the overwhelming one, has been welcoming it, which is to say that people have been pleased that Human Rights Watch has finally acknowledged the reality that we've known for quite some time. The second reaction has been, for those of you who know Arabic, a sah al-nom, good morning reaction, which is for those individuals saying, it's about time that Human Rights Watch has acknowledged the reality in which we've been living. And the reason that it's a sah al-nom, or good morning call, is because it's important to keep in mind that Palestinians have been talking about this for many, many, many years. We have scholars as far back as the late 70s who were talking about the apartheid framework here in Palestine, here in Ramallah, right where I'm sitting. When the wall was first built, it was called the Israeli Apartheid Wall. Since 2005, we've seen activists across campuses in the United States, around the world. The United States and the UK were the first two, focused on Israeli Apartheid Week. We've heard many, many individuals, activists, politicians, academics, you name it, talk about and use this framework of apartheid. And so for some people, and I'll quote a friend of mine, Rain Rabbani, who said, it's not that Israel has crossed the threshold, it's that Human Rights Watch has crossed the threshold. So in other words, and then the third reaction that has been also quite prevalent is, this is important but not enough. That we are actually not just living under a context of apartheid, but it's actually a settler colonial framework. And the settler colonialism is important. And because of this framework, this is where we should be grounding ourselves. So do people see that it's different? Yes, because although we've seen that Palestinians have put forward these different reports, and academics and individuals and so on, the fact that we're now seeing not just Israeli human rights organization, but a global human rights organization also coming to the same conclusion is different for many people. Is it too late? Perhaps, because the fact that the system has gotten so entrenched and so deepened over the years that it's hard to really step back. As I said, we've been talking about this framework for more than 15, 16 years.
Thank you, Diana. And actually, let me build on our friend's statement, Mu'in Rabbani, and thank you for bringing his statement into the discussion about Sah al-Nom for the real threshold that's been crossed is for the human rights groups, not for the apartheid, because it has been going on. So let me see if there is a real threshold has been crossed here. With a question on to Sarah Lee, why, which is on the point of why included the situation inside Israel into this analysis, not just the West Bank. We are seeing the report is not addressing the Israeli practice in the West Bank, Jerusalem, and Gaza, but also inside Israel. Is this any different? Why is it now? Or is it the threshold that Diana mentioned, or there is something else?
Well, two things. I think the issue of the threshold is really in response to those who, almost like a cliche, almost like a talking point, would, whisper in hushed tones for as long as I've been attending conferences and events on Israel-Palestine that, well, if you don't do the two-state solution, then it will be apartheid. And, so the question I would repeatedly ask at these events, and making me no doubt the most unpopular person in the room, was to say, well, when is that magic red line? What is the magic tipping point when you say it's apartheid? Is it in 1 year? Is it in 5 years? Or if it's 20 years, maybe they don't have to worry. What is it that we're waiting for? And might we not consider not only that the threshold has passed and long ago for apartheid, but also for the notion of a two-state solution? If you don't have a two-state solution, then it will be an apartheid one state. And it's here, and it's now, and it's happening. And I think many of us, and my Palestinian friends, leading among them, have been saying this for a very, very long time, but with very little traction. And as Diana was pointing out, it was just so deeply embedded that anytime you talk about Israel-Palestine, the inevitable answer is peace process, two-state solution, peace process. And the other hoary old, when we all know what the solution is, shared capital of Jerusalem and land swaps, and even a long time ago, many of us were saying, what are you talking about? No, those are not the obvious answers. Those are fails, and they're never going to happen. And you have to start dealing with the reality that there is a different plan that is in exercise, no matter what people are saying to your face. In terms of a threshold being crossed by Human Rights Watch, I mean, yes, obviously, the people in the organization have also evolved in sort of understanding and seeing and hinging plans and strategies and thinkings around a so-called two-state solution or a peace process to, those of us from a very long time ago believing it's a sham, but needing to establish that. And what I think is very important about this report is the way that it establishes this comprehensive systemic review of every aspect of oppression and inhumane acts that we have been documenting for decades, and compiles them to show that this is a systematic oppression, but also that it reflects and evidences an intent to dominate. And I think that's the linchpin for the analysis as to why this isn't just about the occupied territory, but also within Israel proper, or Green Line Israel. And that is the same intent to dominate, the same intent to subjugate the Palestinian population, to corral them, to put them in enclosed areas from where they cannot easily move elsewhere, to keep them out of other areas, the nation state law that denies them their identity and relegates them to second, third class identity, that this is part and parcel of one government, one authority, one system with an intent to dominate that is expressed in different ways in Gaza, expressed in different ways in Green Line, expressed in different ways in the West Bank and Jerusalem.
Great, excellent, thank you. Ben, how is it received in Europe? And what impact do you think this can make in Europe? Do you see it can create an impact in Europe?
Well, you saw the report generated a lot of media coverage in Europe, in Britain, where I'm based. There was, the report was welcomed by a number of parliamentarians across Europe, by prominent personalities like Philippe Sands, for example. And it generated a lot of attention from people working in the think tank sphere, in sort of policy analysis, and so on and so forth. I think sort of going forward, the report will be useful in building on existing efforts by, for example, civil society organizations. It will be a boost to the efforts by civil society organizations with respect to looking at accountability. Civil society groups that are working on the BDS campaign, for example. I think it will also play a role and have impact in certain types of spaces where there is the need to push back against efforts to silence and to sort of toxify, as it were, Palestinians and their allies speaking about the situation on the ground for what it is. So I think it can have some positive impact in that respect. And I think it can also, and this is not short term, but I think it can also play a role alongside many other things in shifting and changing conversations amongst policymakers and decision makers in European governments, particularly around things like accountability, and perhaps also around something like the ICC track as well, because of course, Human Rights Watch wrote this report with an eye on, at least in part, the ICC investigation. European governments have unfortunately also needed some encouragement to, in some cases, to sort of respect the independence and neutrality of the court of the ICC. And again, well-documented, well-researched evidence of Israeli crimes, including apartheid and persecution, can only aid those seeking to encourage policymakers and so on to be consistent and faithful to the values that they sort of profess to hold.
Thank you, Ben. Diana, what do you think the Palestinians should do with this report? As you know, they are now busy with the general elections taking place and the controversy that it created over the postponement of the elections. But now you have, this report is happening. In the past, there was a report, the Goldstone report, but we saw that it was dropped in the Human Rights Council as well. So for this report, Diana, what do you think the Palestinians can do with it and should do with it?
It depends on whether you're talking about the Palestinian Authority or the Palestinian civil society. In terms, and it also talks about, it also depends on whether you're talking about geographically. In terms of the Palestinian Authority, I suspect that there isn't going to be a lot that's going to be done. There has already been a letter written to the ICC regarding the crime of apartheid. But as we've seen in the past, so many of these issues end up becoming political, and due to the political pressure that the Palestinian Authority faces, remember, this is not a real government. It's a government that's under military occupation. Every aspect of it is controlled by somebody else, whether it's the Israelis who control movement or the import of goods, or the donors who control where the allocations go within the government itself. So I don't expect that they're going to do a lot with it. I do think that there are things that can be done with it. I think, for example, renewing and redoubling our efforts when it comes to the boycott, divestment, sanctions campaign is very important. Just in the same way that we saw that there was a remedy for apartheid in South Africa, so too we can be looking for those remedies to be applicable when it comes to Palestine. I'm very aware, however, that unlike in the situation of South Africa, where we had the ANC that was actually pushing for this, that in the case of Palestine, Israel's apartheid is not going to be addressed in the same way because of those constraints that I mentioned. The other thing that, of course, can be done is to redouble the efforts when it comes to holding Israel accountable in the ICC. But a major thing that needs to be done is to make sure that Israel is no longer normalized, that it's not treated as a normal state. And this requires a great deal of effort. There already has been a global effort, and I think it's really important for us to keep in mind that there have been students who've been silenced over the years for their activism. There have been people who've been thrown in prison for their activism. And now this report, it's yet another tool that we can push forward. But it's just a question of redoubling the existing efforts that are already there.
Excellent. Thank you, Diana. Sarah Lee, how might the apartheid framework further advocacy within global capitals to further human rights and democracy in Palestine and Israel? What, if anything, should advocates do differently? Do you think for advocacy work, are we seeing or should be seeing something different now that they have a report in their hand confirming the facts that there are or there is an apartheid is taking place? And this is unlike what John Kerry used to say in the past, that if the peace process does not succeed, if there is no solution, then we should or we could probably expect an apartheid soon. So it's no longer about soon. The report is telling us it's happening now, right now, as we speak, right? So there are no, and again, from a New York-based organization that has a history of defending human rights all over the world. So how different that advocacy work will be, if any?
I think there's two critically important tracks of advocacy that I know I'll be pursuing and contributing to, because it's a report from our human rights community and our human rights colleagues. The first is the advocacy within the foreign policy community. We already know that for Palestine advocacy groups, there's nothing surprising here. This is normal. This is what other groups have been saying. We now need to push other people in the foreign policy space that cover the Middle East, that talk about the Middle East, that talk about Israel, Palestine, to deal with this report and to talk about this report. So, my experience is that many think tanks, particularly ones in Washington, but also ones in Europe, even some advocacy groups, even some human rights groups, avoid the topic of Israel, certainly have never said the A word, never said equal rights, and routinely, if the topic comes up, at most they will fall back to, well, we all know what the answer is, a two-state solution with the peace process, yada, yada, yada. So I think our first task is to confront the foreign policy community, who I think have an incredibly important role to play in terms of shaping the narrative and providing people in Congress and policymakers the legitimacy and backing they need to change their own tune, to deal with the report and talk about the report and stop punting. And what I'm sort of have been saying, and now will say even stronger, is that someone's peeking in, is, now my dog wants to go out, is that talking about the two-state solution and the peace process now is a punt, and we're not going to allow it. You got to deal with apartheid now. Deal with the Human Rights Watch report. Do you agree? Do you disagree? If you agree, then start using this analysis anytime you write or talk or give advice about what should be happening in Israel, Palestine. And, I think that this report, in that sense, because it comes from a global organization for which Israel, Palestine is less than 1% of the work, throws the gauntlet down on every other organization working on the region or working globally on these issues to deal with it. I think that will create a lot of space for members of Congress to start tippy-toeing further in the direction which has already started happening. People already are building a backbone in the language they use, because if they hear enough of us saying it, then it's not so stark and sharp and scary anymore, and we give them a cushion. I want to alert you, for example, to the comments of Chris Murphy, Senator Chris Murphy, who said, I have to study the report, and certainly this is the direction it's going in, and maybe in fact it's here. So there's that increasing space, and I know many, many others in Congress will find support and know that they're supported by not Palestine advocates, but the broader think tank community. So I think that's where our push is very much going to be. I think that there is a huge opportunity as well with the International Criminal Court, and you'll note, and I know you mentioned this, but you'll note that the recommendation is specifically to the ICC prosecutor to include an examination of the crime of apartheid and persecution in his now inherited file of crimes in Palestine since 2014. And I want to distinguish this because you've asked a few times from the Goldstone report. The Goldstone report was a snapshot. It was a retrospective about what happened during a particular conflict. The difference with this report is that it's ongoing. It is the state. It's not over. It's not finished. It's not about saying, okay, who is responsible and what should we do now? It's an ongoing thing that's not going to change from one year or the next, unless the conditions change. But I think in our advocacy now, our framing has to be about how, for example, the US is supporting authoritarian governments, abusive governments, and apartheid governments in the region. This is what the United States is doing in the Middle East, and it de-exceptionalizes Israel as just another bad actor, another abusive actor, perhaps more egregious as an apartheid actor in the region.
Thank you, Sarah. And I want to thank you also actually on mentioning the peace process, because I can tell you there hasn't been any more frustrating mechanism for the people on the ground than that brings more frustration to be honest than just saying the peace process. And this is probably one of the major points of the report, right? People are suffering. There is a crime. There is crimes against humanities taking place. There is an apartheid is taking place. Stop saying there is a peace process. Just address it and then work on the peace process. You cannot just ignore the sufferings of the people. And now we are seeing the whole general elections, the democratization of or the elections in Palestine are collapsing, whether it's the real reason of the people voting in Jerusalem or not. But it has served a goal to undermine the democratic progress or the voting process and elections that was supposed to be taking place during this time. So this is something where the report is trying to go differently and say, recognize it, deal with it, right, and separate it from the frustrating mechanism of keep saying a peace process. So this takes me actually for another question for Ben, which is on the government level. What recommendations do you have for policymakers in Europe and in the US, right? We heard Sarah Lee talking about their experience in NGOs and civil society, how different they're going to deal with it. But we heard also like the Biden administration, who, by the way, delivered a strong speech in his foreign policy speech in February about what he called the Democratic Alliance and supporting democracy and human rights in the world, right? And emphasizing the need to support democracy in the world. But when it comes to the Palestinians, then the official statements we heard from the Biden administration is that this is an internal affairs for the Palestinian government and for the Palestinian people to decide, which is no longer for him a part of the alliance of democracy that he wanted or that he promised in his foreign policy speech back in February. What recommendations do you have for policymakers, whether it's in the US or in Europe, how they should deal with this report? Because again, It's no longer about John Kerry's statement back in 2014 that if there is no peace, then soon might be apartheid. Now, this report is telling us it is happening now. What do you advise policymakers?
Well, I would first of all highlight the fact that the Human Rights Watch report includes a number of specific policy recommendations. And, you know, just because there might seem to be a gap between some of these recommendations and the current reality is no reason why they shouldn't be taken seriously, and they shouldn't be worked for and strategized for, you know, according to different contexts. I mean, two specific policy demands that the report makes of governments, just to read effectively a short quotes. You know, number one, condition arms sales and military and security assistance to Israel on authorities taking concrete and verifiable steps towards ending their commission of the crimes of apartheid and persecution. A second practical recommendation that the report made was that governments should, quote, vet agreements, cooperation schemes, and all forms of trade and dealing with Israel to screen for those directly contributing to the commission of the crimes of apartheid and persecution. So the report makes a number of excellent specific policy recommendations that it's, you know, urging governments to take seriously. I would also seek to make, personally speaking, a broader point, and that is that I would recommend that policymakers see the new report as a serious contribution to analyzing the situation on the ground and as it's developed over the years. And I think in particular, to take seriously how the report undermines some commonly held myths or assumptions which have a remarkable staying power or in terms of persisting and shaping policy making. So, for example, I think the report is useful in confronting a persistent error that I think is, you know, sometimes committed or often committed, maybe with no ill intent, but it's an error that focuses on settler numbers, settler population, and how many units are being added to settlements and so on and so forth. A focus on these numbers and the issue of a supposed cutting off point to a two-state solution, which has been mentioned. And I think really to emphasize that, you know, the question that's sometimes asked, well, you know, how many settlers is too many, or would a settlement in X location render a two-state solution impossible, and so on. What really needs to be focused on is the politics as much as the practicalities, right? And the politics and the ideology that informs what we see happening on the ground, right? What the settlement policy says about intent. You know, it's not about and this is one of the things that the report helps to demonstrate because of its historical and historical trajectory and documentation of contemporary events, is that the key question is, you know, the fact that Israeli government after Israeli government of varying political persuasions within the Israeli spectrum in terms of parties and coalition makeup, successive governments have advanced Israel's control and colonization of you know, specifically, for example, in this case, the occupied West Bank. And, you know, that has advanced over the years. The settlements are, of course, they are a practical problem in that sense, but they're also a statement of intent, right? The settlements demonstrate effectively what Israel's intent is with the area, which is to maintain permanent control, but not to grant Palestinian basic rights. And just quickly, I think also, you know, there has been discussion quite rightly about the fact that sort of discussing Israeli policies and as a form of apartheid has a long history. It goes right back. Palestinian scholars were analyzing it as a form of apartheid many, many decades ago. And there's been this issue of, okay, well, now Human Rights Watch have sort of only now decided to say it. I think what is interesting, of course, is that for people who read the report, including policymakers, the report makes it pretty clear that the vast majority of what it documents has been going on for many years. So, you know, the fact that the report is now, okay, there's different reasons for that, but people reading that will also understand that these practices are long-standing and go back a long way, you know, all the way back through to the Nakba. So, yeah, I think just overall, I'd summarize there the value of it for policymakers as a tool of analysis and as a tool of, and as another way, of course, there've been many ways, but as another way of undermining these commonly held assumptions that are sort of stalling and blocking progress with respect to Palestinian rights?
Thank you, Ben. Let me ask Diana, you are a lawyer. What do you advise from a legal standpoint that can be done? Whether by the Palestinian government, you advise the PLO chairman, and you advise the negotiation team, or from civil rights group standpoint. Is there something can be done legally, Diana?
Yes, I want to begin with an anecdote, which is going to bring in both of what Sarah Lee mentioned and what Ben mentioned, and a little bit of what you mentioned. Back in the early days of the negotiations process, the Israeli government had started a project, a new Israeli settlement called Har Homa. They'd announced it during the height of the negotiations. And at the time, complaints were made by the Palestinian government, by the PLO to the Americans, and not just to the Americans, to all of the parties involved, about the construction of this new settlement. And as Ben mentioned, settlements indicate intent. They're not just buildings. These are not little caravans. These are actual full-fledged cities that are fully integrated into Israel. And the complaints that were made were met with the following statement: don't worry about it. It will all get undone through the peace process. And fast forward a few years later, when Har Homa is not just the construction of a small settlement, but now a huge settlement that's fully integrated in the Gush Etzion block in the Bethlehem region, completely blocks off access to the surrounding villages of Bethlehem. And on top of that, during the same period, the Israelis again now start to build this 8-meter high concrete wall, which takes up large swaths of land and is twice as long as the Green Line. And again, our complaints to the Americans, to the international community, was exactly the same, which is, don't worry about it. It will all be undone with the peace process. And the reason that that I'm raising this is because for such a long time, the only demand that we've had is one of accountability. That Israel not be allowed to be above the law, and that we are not continually treated as though we're beneath the law. And so for me, the importance of this report, and again, I want to stress that this isn't the first, and I really do hope that from here on in that people are still pointing to the fact that it's Palestinians who've been saying this for quite some time. The value of this report is to use it as a tool for accountability. And I think it is possible to do that. I do think that it's not just a question of the ICC track, but also holding governments accountable for their continued interactions with Israel, with apartheid Israel. This isn't just an occupation, but apartheid Israel. And also, I think it's very important for us in places where we have those domestic abilities to do so, to not only push for BDS, but again, to be challenging these actions legally. I can tell you that in the country of my birth, which is Canada, that these efforts have been tried, and they've been tried in other countries around the world. And I feel that now we're getting to a point where, with more and more of these reports being written, I'm predicting, I don't have a crystal ball, but I'm predicting that this isn't just going to be Human Rights Watch. I predict other human rights organizations are going to come out with similar reports. That I think that we're at a place where there's a threshold that has been crossed in terms of the way that the world views Israel. And on that, this is where I believe it's for us to continue to hold Israel accountable. Process will undo it. We all know what the solution is, or another wall and be told the same thing.
Thank you, Diana. This is very, very helpful. I appreciate that. I would like to ask one final question, actually, for the three of you, just like final thoughts, which is the question: where do we go from here? Should we expect? Are we expecting new reports to come in the near future? We haven't seen the Israeli reaction to it yet on the ground. We know that they deported the Human Rights Watch director in Israel-Palestine a while ago. Are they going to take actions on the ground of preventing, people from going to the to Palestine? As Diana said, this also establishes ground for legal action. We have seen how the Israeli government responded to the ICC investigation, challenging and denying and and trying to frustrate their work. Where do we go from here? Are there new reports that are we expecting new reports that are going to be soon? And are we in the beginning of, especially if there are other reports, are we in the beginning of a global movement similar to the anti-apartheid in South Africa that started in the 70s and all of that? So especially, I mean, if there are voices, and as we see, we have seen three really major developments: B'Tselem, Human Rights Watch, and the ICC, all, my friends, within a few months, right? And who knows what's next? Are we seeing the start of a new a global movement on the anti-apartheid? And what's your prediction? What's your expecting as we move forward? Just your final thoughts on this issue from each one of you, and I would appreciate it. Go ahead, Sarah Lee.
Well, a couple of things. I think in terms of where we go next, I mean, we've already touched on it, but I do think there will be more reports coming. I don't want to reveal other organizations' plans, but I know that there's another major human rights organization that is also working on a report documenting the crime of apartheid and persecution in Palestine by Israel. Whether we have a global movement, I don't know. Sadly, I think what we're missing from the ingredients of all the wrongs that are happening around the world is the absence of a global movement or even a regional movement or a quasi-regional movement. And I've written about this in the context of the Arab uprisings, that what was missing was a transnational movement for democracy and rights, like the non-aligned movement, like the anti-colonial movement, the anti-imperialist movements, which were global movements that united people fighting the same struggles around the world. That is sadly missing from many of the struggles in the Middle East today. And it's specifically missing that dimension for Palestine-Israel. So it remains seen as a sui generis problem of Palestine and Israel, a special, unique conflict. And what we at Dawn want to do, and what we believe is correct and appropriate, is to de-exceptionalize it and make it part of a global problem against tyranny, occupation, apartheid, oppression, that requires some form of global solidarity, but sadly is very, very absent. On the plus side, because Israel is sui generis in the extent to which it receives international backing and support, particularly from the United States, and the extent to which it is a creation of the international community via the UN and to literally create the state of Israel, that's where the action can appropriately be centered, and maybe it doesn't need a global movement. I think the other big question is whether the people in Palestine, particularly in the occupied territory, are willing to adopt this framework. I can tell you that over the past decade of having these conversations with people on the ground, including talking about equal rights, equal civil and political rights, there was a great deal of resistance. There was a great deal of resistance to giving up the occupation law analysis. And I don't want to name this person, but a very, very serious and dedicated Palestine activist said, you want us to give up the protections of international law, which of course we've never had, for the protections of another body of law that is even more of a threshold to cross, even a bigger sort of scarier barrier for people to reach to. And I understand that, and I sympathize with that. But ultimately, that's where I think it needs to go. And it's a question mark of whether or not it's going to go in terms of what people want on the ground, and whether they're going to allow themselves to be distracted by, you know, the tomfoolery of a PA election, as opposed to a national demand that the PA resign and put itself and everyone else out of its misery.
Thank you, Sarah. Let me take Diana's thought. I know, Diana, you have a class and you want to go to your class. So let me hear your final thoughts, and in 2 minutes, and you can go to your class.
I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Are there going to be future reports? Yes, undoubtedly. What has been Israel's reaction? You know, as usual, the reaction is always to malign the individuals rather than to actually the merits, because they can't, and instead they just malign the individuals. They say bad things, as they've done with Ahmad, with the human rights staff that's here, including Khalid Badawi. And these people have been, and Ken Roth, etc. They've been subjected to incredible attacks on social media and elsewhere, and that's their style. What's interesting here, though, Ibrahim, is that the reason that it's had no reaction is because Israelis know that this is apartheid. They've known it for quite some time. In fact, I was recalling that it was back, I believe, in 2014 or 2015, that there was a full-page ad that was taken out in one of the Israeli dailies, the most common Israeli daily, called Israel Hayom, Israel Today, in which they talked about apartheid, and all they said was, this is a term that we need to fight back against. But they didn't deny that there is apartheid. And so in terms of what the Israelis are doing, they're just going to continue with business as usual, because they've been allowed to continue as business as usual. And this is why I think it's so vitally important that we really do push and hold them to account for their actions. But that being said, I think the debate about 2 states, 1 state, all of that is a little bit different and separate. And for the time being, for me, the focus should be on accountability. And thank you.
Thank you, Diana. I appreciate your thought, and thank you for being with us. And this conversation will continue. We will be talking again, but now you can go to your class, and we are very grateful for your time, Diana. And we'll just hear final thought from Ben, and then we can take it from there.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I think the Human Rights Watch report, like other reports, but we've been talking about the significance of this report in particular during this event. I think it's useful for analyzing and for organizing. You know, those are sort of 2 ways that I can see this continuing to have impact, continuing to be a boost in terms of helping people to analyze what's going on and boosting the efforts of those organizing to hold Israel to account. I mean, I do think it's important also to recognize and to acknowledge, of course, that there's always a sense with these types of reports or breakthroughs and so on, that it can feel too late and not enough, right? And I think it's appropriate to to reflect on, for example, events in Jerusalem at the moment, the oppression that's being experienced by a lot of the Palestinian youth in the city, about the evictions that are, hopefully not, but seem to be pending in Sheikh Jarrah. And, it's another report. It's a report that is and will be useful. It's important. And there's many ways in which it reflects progress and the opening up of important spaces to say certain things. But I think, in terms of going forward, it's actually really a question of the long, hard work continuing, and may there be, many more of these kinds of boosts, to come.
Thank you, Ben. With that, let me thank you all for your time and for your thoughts on this really serious development in this area that, again, we are really seeing a threshold being crossed, regardless of who's crossing this threshold, whether it's the rights groups or the apartheid. But we are seeing that there is a threshold being crossed, and my own thoughts, I do not think this is going to be the end of it. I think there will be others because it seems, again, we have a pattern on our hands with 3 major developments happening within a few months, and this pattern tells us that we should expect probably to see more in the future, which gives us hope that also this conversation will continue. So we will be in touch again and again. I'm sure your advice will always be instrumental, will be very helpful to rights groups, to policymakers, and for us as well in academia, and the way that we're trying to make sense of these developments. With that, I thank you again, and hopefully we will see you in the future soon when this human challenge of the COVID-19 crisis is over soon, and humanity is recovering, and we're meeting physically somewhere. Thank you again, and I look forward to continuing this conversation in the future. Thank you, Sarah Lee, and thank you, Ben.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Ibrahim. Thanks.
Bye.